You know, ladies and gentlemen, the Heritage Foundation, if not one of the most important institutions in Washington, D.C., government included, non-government included. It was relied on very heavily by President Reagan and others. It was really the first of its kind, a real conservative think tank across the board on economics, foreign policy, on the Constitution, the judiciary. Ed Meese worked there for a significant amount of time after he retired from the Reagan administration. I spent a lot of time there. It's a fascinating and fantastic place. And its president is a great guy, Kevin Roberts. Kevin Roberts, how are you, my friend?
Mark Levin, what a great patriot you are. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're very, very kind. I got through your book, and it was actually easy to read. It is a fantastic book. Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. I mean, you cover like the whole field. You talk about what needs to change in Washington. And not just in Washington. What needs to change, period, what ought to be eliminated, that is, let it die or kill it, and then what other institutions can be created and so forth and so on. I mean, is this like your magnus opus or something? I mean, it's really quite remarkable.
Well, that's the attempt, and obviously I get a lot of help because I work with the great policy scholars at Heritage, and we've got this policy where we speak with one voice because we want to go spend our donors' hard-earned dollars actually advocating for one single solution on certain policies. But what I tried to do is to put all of that in one book and explain, to tell you and your audience something you know, that Washington's broken, but to explain something that we don't often say enough as conservatives, and that is, how do we fix it? And so what I lay out there, as you read, and thanks so much for reading it over the weekend, is not just what needs to happen in Washington, but what needs to happen in state and local governments, and even beyond that, Mark, and I would argue this is the most important point that I emphasize, we have to regenerate our institutions, our schools, our colleges, universities, dare I say, media industry. And I use this metaphor of a controlled burn, which the Forest Service uses to regenerate forests, obviously mean that figuratively, where we go institution by institution, revitalizing them, regenerating them. And those that don't get with the program are just going to wither on the vine and die because Americans will realize they no longer are places where we can transmit our values from one generation to the next.
Let's dig into a few of these chapters here. And one of the ones I like the most is right up front, Chapter 2, Fighting Fire with Fire. You generally alluded to it. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, I'm an outdoorsman, and when I lived out in the Rocky Mountain West a couple of times, I realized that particularly under Democrat presidents, that there were a lot of forest fires. My former Texas Public Policy Foundation colleague, Chuck DeVore, has mapped this out. It sounds
Good
crazy
man.
to say, but he is a great man. The reason that this is important is because what happens is that liberal Forest Service managers simply don't do the controlled burns of forests they need to do. This, by the way, is why we have all of these forest fires, not because of so-called climate change. Well, because of spending some time in the outdoors and searching for that metaphor in the book that would explain in sort of an easy to understand way what I mean by revitalizing institutions, it occurred to me one day, it's the controlled burn. And so in the same way that the cultural arsonists of the radical left have gone institution by institution, K through 12 schools, colleges and universities, the Boy Scouts of America, and I say that as a proud Eagle Scout, I think we as conservatives need to take this concept of the controlled burn and say it's now our turn, not to obviously literally set fire to anything, but to metaphorically say that we are going to be in power, not just in politics, but on the boards of these universities, leading these schools. And I think if we have that mindset, while our politics are going a little bit better, then I believe we've got real hope to take back this country.
Mm-hmm. And that chapter, ladies and gentlemen, is really quite compelling. You're only going to hear little pieces of these chapters right now, the book right now, but this is the perfect time for this book. The election's over. Now we've got to be thinking about what we want to do with the culture, what we want to do with other institutions, and so forth and so on. And this is an extraordinarily helpful book. Let's take a look. Schools should teach piety. Piety. This is very important. What do you mean by piety?
In our pluralistic society, piety means an understanding of what you and I would call the natural law, but even perhaps more pointedly than that, a reverence for what has come before us. For some of us, even accounting for our different religious traditions, the practice of that piety is going to look different. But what is going to be 100% identical is that when we wake up each day, Mark, we have a reverence for the cultural inheritance we have in the United States. And what I try to draw out there is that if you think about the sense of loss that Americans are feeling and that they voted in a certain way last week to fix, that loss isn't just the American dream per se. It's that there is a loss of piety, there is a loss of reverence. And one of the places, I argue, the major place that used to perpetuate, to cultivate the sense of piety in each generation was in our schools, even in our public schools. And it is, I think our public schools happen to be the best example of this institutional rot that occurs in spite of the great people who still work in them because we have allowed it to happen. Recapturing that and doing that in a way that reflects, local mores and regional customs. These are things that we did for centuries in the United States of America. It wasn't until we created the U.S. Department of Education in 1979 that we adopted, in a formal sense, this top-down approach that has rooted out this piety.
And this piety is so important because we have all these people pouring into the country, and if they're not going to be assimilated into this piety, among other things, in these public schools, it's never going to happen, I don't think. When you look at culture, when you look at television, when you look at all kinds of entertainment, it's just not going to happen. The schools used to be the place, right?
That's right. In fact, even when I was in school, I'm 50 years old. I've only gone to public schools. That sense of piety was profound. And one of the things that we weren't necessarily taught in the way of direct instruction. We were taught by the example of our teachers. We were taught by the books that we were reading, was that the culture outside the school was something that you might be part of, but that your education in an American public school improved your ability to navigate. That is one of the things we have lost.
I can't get enough of this. The book is Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. You're going to love this book. It's really inspiring, actually, by Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation. Kevin, tell us a little bit about how you came up with the idea to put this book together, when it was supposed to be released, and so forth. Give us a little backstory on this.
Yeah, the real quick of a long version, and I'll spend more time on the shorter context. I'm an early American historian by training, and so I've been thinking about writing a popular history book, if you will, for a long time, especially since I left full-time academic work. But when you're president of a group like Heritage, the best part of your job is actually promoting your colleagues' work. And so I spent several months at Heritage, and I realized, I can actually elevate the work of my colleagues by trying to create a synthesis of all of our ideas, but we need to do so in a way that certainly acknowledges the problems we must confront politically, socially, economically, while also being hopeful. And I use some personal stories to emphasize why all of us should be hopeful in spite of things that happened to us early in our life. And so we had decided that we would proceed with this book being published sometime in September. And then you might have noticed, Mark, that over the summer, the left just went sort of haywire in mischaracterizing this transition project that we work on every 4 years. And I was really busy, not just with that, but also with Heritage Action, our more political campaign arm, making sure we were registering voters in Arizona and Georgia and chasing those ballots. So we decided that we would publish this book this week because, regardless of how the election went, the country, and especially conservatively minded Americans, would need to have a positive vision of where we go next, and that's what this book attempts to do.
It's not easy to write a book like this. I don't care how many people you have helping you. You got to put it together. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. It's got to make sense and so forth. And this one certainly does. Freedom, this is a big one. It's very important. Chapter 6, Freedom Requires Order. What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the things I would emphasize to every classroom of students I've had, from high schoolers to college students, is that the greatest thing philosophically the United States offers isn't freedom per se, but it's this concept of ordered liberty, that we have these two competing goods of being free and also living in an orderly society. And in the United States, we try to balance this. In fact, we're at our best if you think about the golden eras in American history, when Americans not only felt free, but they also understood that American society was stable, it was orderly, it was something that you should sort of expect what would happen tomorrow and the next week. And if you think about just that short description I mentioned of a stable American society, you realize that particularly in the last 3.5 years, but increasingly over the last 3 or 4 decades, fewer and fewer Americans would say that while they feel a little more free, they actually feel like they live in a stable society. This is what we're trying to recapture, and it requires us to remember the following. As important as politics and policy are, and I certainly talk about them, what's the most important thing is for us to cultivate in ourselves the true definition of freedom, which is the right to do what we ought. In fact, I would even say the moral obligation to do what we ought for one another, for our community, and ultimately for our nation state. And if we have that reminder, if we have that framing in the work that we're doing in our local communities, in our politics, and I use examples of just sort of ordinary Americans who do these things, I actually think our politics gets better, and it leads us back to this perfect balance of liberty and order.
One of the chapters that really brings it up to speed in terms of foreign policy, I mean, staring us in the face is communist China. It is a grave, grave threat, and you point that out in your book. Elaborate on that.
Well, we're going to have to walk and chew gum and do something else all at the same time, because as you talk about so eloquently, we have the threat from Russia, we have the very present threat of Iran, and the thing that we've been trying to sound the alarm bells on at Heritage the last 3 years is that even with the threats from the Russians and the Iranians, the Chinese Communist Party is, in my estimation, the greatest adversary in the history of the United States. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because they have been so insidious and effective at infiltrating our institutions. And so the other premise of the book, which is that we have to revitalize our institutions, collides with this claim that we've made at Heritage about the CCP. And so confronting the threat of the Chinese communists will require us not just to improve our military and our defense industrial base and to have a much clearer geopolitical vision, but we're going to have to balance these competing interests in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and China, to say nothing of what's going on in our own backyard in Latin America. But I argue, to sum up here about China, Mark, that if, in fact, we can confront China, we can be sober about it, and by the way, I think we will under Donald Trump, that actually is going to be a telltale case of how we do this with other adversaries around the world. In other words, it will pay dividends down the road.
And right now, I don't even think the country has been properly informed, is psychologically ready. I think China is extremely aggressive. They're in our hemisphere. It's like the Monroe Doctrine doesn't even exist anymore. Their Navy is now bigger than our Navy, and they've made it clear they intend to invade and conquer Taiwan in 2 or 3 years. They devoured Hong Kong without any pushback. They're fighting with the Philippines and Japan and Australia and even Vietnam. They are a grave threat to us, aren't they?
They're grave. And, all those examples you mentioned, which really came home to me or for me during my first trip to Taiwan and Japan earlier this year, it was made even more striking when I visited with several dozen ambassadors from African nations, which Heritage, of course, does. And the thing they told me was, Kevin, we have a choice, average African nation. We can choose the woke ideology of Biden's America, where they will, require us to salute to all of this leftist nonsense, or we get to take, quote unquote, loans, that you don't have to pay off from the Chinese Communist Party. And that's a very difficult decision. In other words, we want to be allies with the United States, but the United States is not a good ally right now. So we're taking this money from China. That's the kind of thing that's happening in Africa. It's one of the reasons that South America has largely lurched to the left, even with the exception of Javier Milei in Argentina. This is the kind of thing that the next Secretary of State is going to have to do. And if rumors are true that that's Senator Rubio, then I am ecstatic because he understands all of this so well. Well,
ladies and gentlemen, you only got a little taste of this book, and it's my honor to introduce you to Kevin Roberts. Kevin Roberts, to this fantastic patriotic audience. This book is Dawn's Early Light. I want to strongly encourage you to grab it. All you have to do is go on any of my social sites or go directly to Amazon.com. Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. This is a book you're very much going to like, enjoy. It's intriguing, and it'll certainly be something you can talk about at Thanksgiving in a very, very positive way. Again, Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America, Amazon.com, or go to any of my platforms and grab a copy. Kevin Roberts, we're not going to have you as a stranger here. We're going to have you more often, if you don't mind. We really appreciate you.
Well, I love your show, so I would love to do that anytime you're ready. Thanks so much, my friend.
God bless to you and your family. Take care of yourself. It's a good man. The Heritage Foundation. It's a fantastic organization. I've always supported it. I've always liked it. It is a big deal.